Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, a special selection Sunday edition. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. A lot to dive into. We finally got the first 12-team college football playoff bracket. Oregon, no surprise, the #1 overall seed. What else jumped out to you as we finally got to see the 4 first-round byes, seeds 1 through 4? We got the home games, and then SMU gets in over Alabama for the last at-large spot.
Well, I'll tell you this. We were emotional every Tuesday when they were releasing the rankings, and I feel way less emotional today because I do think at the end they got it right. Now, there's a structure issue with this bracket and in the way that the auto bids correlate with the first-round byes. Seen people on Twitter talking about Oregon getting rewarded by having to play Ohio State or Tennessee, whereas if you're Penn State, you get SMU and you get Boise State. We'll get that figured out. The thing that I wanted to see yesterday, and we talked about this, was Clemson winning the ACC in a close game because I wanted the committee to have to make a decision about what they were going to do with SMU and Alabama. Alabama with 2 egregious losses, a 3-loss team in total, and SMU, who's played pretty good football. They made the right decision there. So I actually like the way that the committee selected the teams this year.
I completely agree. I made a projection right at the end of the night, and I had SMU in as the final at-large team because otherwise you're essentially saying that conference championships don't matter or that you shouldn't want to play in them, right? Because if SMU went from being comfortably in the field to out of the bracket entirely after a 3-point loss to Clemson, you have a huge problem because no one's going to want to play in those games and you're disincentivizing them. If you're a fan, why would you go to those games? There would be no reason to have them. And right now they're baked into everybody's media contracts and they're part of the deal. Like, you want to get to them. You want to be rewarded. You want to try to win a championship. So I think the committee did what they had to do with SMU over an Alabama team that has 3 losses, and 2 of them are to 6-6 SEC teams.
Right.
Like, those were not good losses, and one of them was a blowout loss only a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and they didn't score a touchdown in that game. Like, I'm really not trying to hear this. And the conversation around Alabama has gotten so off the rails. People are like, well, what's the incentive to schedule hard? Well, they had a not great Wisconsin team in the non-con. They played South Florida, which was not a great game. They had Mercer in Western Kentucky. Like, this is not a scheduling issue. They lost to 2 teams in their conference. You mentioned 6-6 records. Those were not very good teams. I do want to say, though, there is part of me that resonates with this idea that it is much more difficult to win football games in college football than it is to lose. I think people are, like, discrediting the fact that Alabama did beat good teams. You have to draw the line somewhere, though. And if you can't score a touchdown against a 6-6 football team, I think that's where the line is. I don't feel bad for Alabama. But this conversation just got so off the rails to me. It was kind of crazy. But the committee made the right decision.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think that in the first year of the 12-team playoff, if we're really only talking about one spot, and you could say that you don't actually feel all that bad for the team that got left out because they lost a quarter of their games in the regular season and 2 losses to 6-6 teams.
Right.
I feel like the committee did a good job then. This was probably the right amount of teams if we're only debating one. I think the other thing that we could talk about, Joshua, is the order of some of the teams that played this weekend, because this was something when we're looking for potential snubs or surprises. We weren't really sure what the committee was going to do with Texas having lost to Georgia for a 2nd straight time. So it's kind of 1 loss, or is it 2 losses? I don't know. Like, you're 2 losses to the same good team in overtime. And then you have a Penn State loss, 8 points to Oregon, the #1 team in the country. How do you handle that? The committee basically didn't penalize either of those teams. They went Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, which didn't play and is ineligible for a top 4 seed. And I think that's pretty justifiable for 5, 6, and 7. They all get to host home games, and the teams that played good quality competition and lost in the extra game didn't end up getting hurt too much.
Yeah, the justifiable thing, I think, is like the most interesting word in this because it's predicated off of this idea of the imbalance of schedules. The only reason we're asking the question about how much do you penalize, can you penalize, et cetera. And so for Texas, I totally get where they're at because it does feel like you lost to the same team. Maybe that's more of a matchup issue than a how good is Texas issue. But also you look at their schedule from this year. They got a pretty favorable draw, didn't have a ton of good teams, so I know that's kind of lingering. The Penn State one we had talked about yesterday because there's the Ohio State thing and how closely they're grouped together. Ohio State with a head-to-head. The only reason Penn State was in there is because Ohio State lost to a team that wasn't them, right? And so it's like, how do you handle that? But again, I think if you're trying to say that conference championships are valuable, and we saw from attendance and from the excitement of those games, people don't feel that way. So if you're trying to say that, you can't penalize these teams.
Right. And again, like, they are valuable, especially to the SEC,
right.
which I think is why you're seeing, like, I saw a lot of my pals in SEC media making the case that SMU should have been in as the last team in, because that does mean something to get and to win a conference championship game. I want to talk about some other surprises, or maybe not so surprises, but questions that we had for the bracket. We wanted to know who was going to be the number 3 and the number 4 overall seeds.
Right.
We can get into how we don't personally like that, the conference champions have like automatic designated spots in the bracket, but there was a lot at stake. And we saw a lot of arguing, right? As soon as Boise State won on Friday night, whether or not they should get a first round bye over the Big 12 team, which ended up being Arizona State. Both those teams, top 20 wins this weekend.
Right.
But Boise State entered the weekend 5 spots ahead of them, and they stayed. What ended up happening, though, SMU loses, knocks out Clemson, 5th conference champion, because they're ranked the lowest, and therefore both Boise State and Arizona State get first round byes. It is that order, though. So ASU is 4th behind Boise State, which is pretty remarkable. There were a lot of people who thought that the group of 5 champion would always be the 12 seed.
Sure.
And they just beat out 2 conference champions to get that 3 seed.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing to look at. And what's funny about this, like, I don't have a problem with it because, again, it's justifiable based off of what the committee told us they thought about these teams all year long. I do think there is a conversation about maybe did the committee value Boise State a little bit too much. Like, they got off to really hot start. Ashton Genty, obviously a draw for a lot of people. But in the meat of their schedule, there were some games there that were like a little bit sticky at times. And then for Arizona State, they continue to just like play really good football. And then you could go back and look at the losses and say, well, those make a lot of sense. Starting quarterbacks out, things of that nature. And maybe they had them ranked too low the whole time.
Yeah.
And so when you get to this point in the year, I don't think it would have made a ton of sense for them to jump Arizona State over Boise. You told us the whole year that you like Boise better, but the idea here is like maybe they valued these teams 1 too high and 1 too low for most of the season.